Hello, everyone. My name is Yingyi Ma. I'm Associate Professor of Sociology in Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. And it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you all to the roundtable of the future of U.S.-China economic and political relations. There's no doubt that the U.S.-China relations is at a crossroads right now, and therefore the theme of this roundtable is both timely and time-sensitive. So it's my great pleasure to introduce to you our distinguished panelists. First, Professor Alan Carlson. Professor Carlson is Associate Professor of Government at Cornell University. Professor Carlson is currently researching on the issue of non-traditional security in China's emerging relationship with the rest of the international system. Next, Professor Jeffry Frieden is a professor of government at Harvard University. He specializes in the politics of international monetary and financial relations. And then our very own Professor Mary Lovely is a professor of economics and Eggers Faculty Scholar at Syracuse University and senior fellow at the Peterson Institute.
So, Alan, thanks so much. I did want to ask you about kind of the U.S.-China relationship a little bit, and specifically about the forthcoming election in the United States. Now, for nearly 4 years, the Trump administration has created a number of new challenges with Beijing. But back in 2016, it was quite clear that the Chinese, even if they didn't say so openly, they were silently cheering Trump on. Do you think that sentiment will hold now for the 2020 election?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Dimitar, especially given the level of volatility and turbulence in the relationship as a result of the pandemic. And so clearly, the leadership in China isn't going to change over the next 4 or 5 years, but there is a potential for a shift in the White House. And so to answer the question, I think it's worthwhile to go back a little bit and reflect upon why it is that Beijing did appear to have a preference for Trump in 2016, and then consider the contours of the relationship over the past 3.5 years and how that speaks to the present and future within the relationship. So yeah, I actually in 2015, 2016, I spent quite a bit of time in China, and was sort of flummoxed, quite frankly, by the enthusiasm which did exist in a lot of corners in Beijing at that time for Trump, who had gone to become president. I think it was more, though, less about Trump and more about Hillary Clinton and the degree to which she was unknown to them and a known critic, going way back to her time as First Lady, 1995, and the World Women's Conference in Beijing, where she spoke about human rights violations through her time as Secretary of State under the Obama administration. And the degree, too, that the Obama administration had begun to move towards a sort of harsher policy line towards China in the second part of his second term in office. And so I think that they were concerned that Clinton would continue the Obama policies. And in contrast, I think in Trump, they saw a neophyte who they thought might not be an intelligence asset, but at least would be someone who would be relatively easy to manipulate. And so there was, I think they were happily surprised in November of 2015 when he ended up being elected. Although that satisfaction, I think, proved to be quite short-lived. As you know, even before the president took office, he had a direct phone call with Tsai Ing-wen, the president of Taiwan, which I think was the first suggestion, and that Beijing would have gotten that this was going to become a different sort of relationship. And then subsequently, over the course of his first term in office, Trump's policies have been, frankly, fairly erratic. And I think this is a reflection of the fact that his White House is divided between very hawkish voices, like we see in his trade advisor, Peter Navarro, to a degree, Matthew Pottinger on the security side, and not quite doves on China, but at least those who see an economic rationale for continuing the relationship. And so Trump a lot of times appears that he just kind of is mirroring or parroting whatever he hears from the last person he talked to about China policy. This came together obviously in the trade war, which until the last few months was the defining element of US-China relations over the past 3-4 years. And the breakthrough, or at least supposed breakthrough of that, with the announcement of a deal last fall, and the phase one agreement in that context, with China agreeing to buy, I guess it was $200 billion in U.S. agricultural goods. Even then, though, that seemed as if that agreement was a little bit more fictitious than real. There were lots of questions about the details and about the degree to which China would actually could even buy that much American product, but they were soon rushed aside or washed over by the COVID-19 epidemic into the pandemic, which has enveloped the world. And so now looking forward, I think that to a degree all bets are off in terms of what Beijing might be expecting. However, through all of this, at the same time, though, Trump has maintained some sort of an admiration for the Chinese leader Xi Jinping, and that really is kind of, in a lot of cases, offset his more combative rhetoric with more kind of ongoing levels of cooperation. We saw that with the Hong Kong protests, again, throughout the course of the trade deal, and even in the early period of the pandemic, where he assured the world that he'd had word from Xi Jinping that things were fine and he trusted Xi's judgment on these things. So taking that all together, I guess that the Chinese probably would be okay with another 4 years of Trump. But I think they're probably even more leery about that prospect than they were before. The problem is that Biden doesn't really present them with a particularly appealing option either. And I think there's little question over the next few months as we move towards the general election that both parties' nominees will probably, when it comes to China, just sort of be positioning vis-a-vis each other to try to be even more harsh on China than the other side. There's really no constituency left in the US right now that's kind of pro-China or pro-cooperation. And as a result, I think that the relationship is in for, in the short term at the very least, a lot of upheaval, especially as both Beijing and Washington move to try to pin the blame for the pandemic on the other side. I think here in the US, we're most aware of the president and his advisors' attempts in this regard, whether it's initially talking about the Wuhan virus or the China virus, more recently with kind of percolating discussions about somehow enacting retaliatory measures against China for the virus getting out. Members of the president's own party, in particular Senator Cotton, have really pushed actually to bring litigation against China to hold them responsible for the losses that the pandemic has caused. And so in that regard, I'll just finish, it's hard to be optimistic. I think that this is a relationship that was already under a great deal of stress. And the question may lie on how ambitious Beijing wants to be in this particular context. They've actually benefited a lot from the US-led international order over the past 20, 30 years since reforms and opening started up under Deng in the late 70s. And if that really falls apart, I think that the weight of a sort of economic collapse will be felt as heavily in China as it is here. So maybe that's a way for the two sides to kind of get together and might again suggest that even China at this point isn't all that enthusiastic about another 4 years of President Donald J. Trump.
So it sounds like they'll be just as tuned into the election season as we are. Thank you.
You're right. Yeah, you're welcome.
So Jeff, now that at least some parts of the world are looking forward to reopening after the intentional COVID shutdowns, government stimulus strategies are getting a lot of attention. And observers have noted a sharp difference in the US and the Chinese approach, where the US is on track to infuse at least $3 trillion at this point. China appears to have committed a much smaller sum, estimated to a few hundred billion. And from your point of view, what do we need to know historically and structurally to make sense of these numbers?
Right, so let me say some things about the Chinese stimulus and how the situation there differs from that in the West, and then also raise some broader points as well. In the West, remember that most of the macroeconomic and economic policy response has been aimed at trying to make sure that businesses don't close. Right? Some of it has been direct payments to individuals, but much of the effort has been aimed at firms, small and medium-sized enterprises and large enterprises. And the reason for that is that there's a certain irreversibility when a business closes. If a restaurant is closed for 2 months and then reopens, that's fine. If it closes for 2 months and then goes out of business, that could be 25 people out of work, not to speak of suppliers and others. So you want to try to make sure that businesses have a backstop so that they can reopen rather than go bankrupt as a result of the crisis. Now, that's why the Western governments are typically providing either guaranteed loans or direct subsidies or something along those lines to businesses, both small, medium, and in some cases large as well. China's in a different position because there is very, very heavy state involvement in the economy. Many of the most important firms in China are state-owned enterprises. And so the government doesn't need to provide them with loan guarantees or even with subsidies. There is an implicit and in some cases an explicit guarantee where the central government stands behind the state-owned enterprises. So it would be redundant for them to offer the kinds of loan guarantees or subsidies that the Western governments are offering. So that's one thing to keep in mind, that the fact is that the Chinese economy is a sort of state capitalist, or some have called it a state capitalist communist economy, a state capitalist economy in which the state plays a very, very central role in directing resources. And that's not the case in the West, obviously. So it's not surprising that we find different strategies in an economy where the state is so central to economic activity as we are in the West. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind is that there has, in fact, in China, been a very substantial government involvement in trying to keep the economy going. Most of that has taken the form of an investment, public investment in infrastructure, railroads, high-speed rail, highways, public transportation systems, subways, things like that, both by the central national government and by local and provincial governments. And that has been ramped up. It's been at a very high level ever since the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, and it's been ramped up further in the response to COVID. So there has been a response, and it's largely been on this public investment for infrastructure front. Another thing that may limit the extent of government involvement is that there are some fears. There are some fears about extending government direct involvement in a stimulus program farther because for two basic reasons. The first is, as I've said before, since the financial crisis, which after all is 10 years ago, 12 years ago, the government has been throwing lots and lots of resources into infrastructure investment. And there's a lot of evidence that a lot of that investment, depending on who you believe, either the majority or a significant minority of that investment was not all that efficient. So there's a concern about the government having made a lot of bad investments in infrastructure. That is, highways that are not going to be used or that are shoddily constructed, high-speed rail that's not going to be used or that's of poor quality. So there's a little bit of a reticence about throwing more money especially more public money at the problem when there's some concern that the money that's been thrown at it in the past has not been all that well used. So that is something that I think is something constraint on government spending. And the other is that there's a concern in China, as there has been for quite some time, about the extent of bad loans on the books of Chinese banks, which again are either owned by the government or more or less implicitly guaranteed by the government. There's a lot of concern in China and abroad about financial instability in China. And if more money were thrown at public enterprises or private enterprises, there's a concern that that would just lead to even more bad loans. In other words, the government would be extending loans, or the government would be getting banks to extend loans to companies in real trouble. And that would just add to the book of bad loans in the portfolio of the financial system, which is something the government does not want to do. The financial system is weak enough as it is. They don't want to undertake any efforts that are going to weaken the financial system further. So all of those act as something like brakes on the extent of direct Chinese government involvement. But I would emphasize that when push comes to shove, the central government stands behind, I wouldn't say all, but a very large portion of the firms in China. And so the government is not going to let those major firms go out of business. It's not going to let them go bankrupt. It's not going to let the banks fail. It's going to use the resources that it has as necessary to backstop the macroeconomy. But I think I want to also, in this context, it's important to understand sort of a broader trend in the Chinese political economy. And that is that really for 15 years or so, the Chinese government and observers have recognized that China really faces a major challenge, and that is what's sometimes called rebalancing. Since 1979, when China first opened to the world economy, the government has pursued a very strongly export-led strategy that is throwing not all its resources, but the vast majority of its resources into producing manufactured goods for export to North America, Western Europe, to the rest of the world. And that's been tremendously successful. But I think starting, as I say, about 15 years ago, there was a recognition that that was not sustainable in the long run. First, because as China has developed, its wages have risen, so it's no longer the lowest wage economy in the world, and it's being beaten out of competition by countries like Bangladesh and Vietnam and others. So it can't rely on being able to sell virtually everything it produces in other markets. And second, that the appetite for Chinese imports in North America and Europe is finite. And in fact, we've seen a response, a protectionist response in the US and also in Europe as well, to try to limit the extent of purchases from China. So given that, it's been very clear that the Chinese economy has to reorient so that it's driven more by domestic demand than by export demand, by foreign demand. And that's been in train for 15 years. And it hasn't been all that successful. That is, the government, policymakers have been struggling to get this rebalancing going. To an extent, there has been a shifting of gears. That is, more of economic activity is domestically oriented. But almost all of that change is because of the public investment I just mentioned, talking about the infrastructure investment before. It's been very difficult for the Chinese to get domestic consumer demand to become the driver of the Chinese economy. And a healthy economy, especially one as large as the Chinese, is going to rely on domestic demand, on domestic consumers wanting to buy locally produced goods. And that hasn't changed much in China. That the share of domestic demand accounted for by consumers has been stable or declining over the last 15 years, when really, from the standpoint of healthy economic growth, that should be rising continually. So there is this underlying problem in the Chinese economy with moving away from this export-led model, which worked for decades, and much more towards the kind of model that most advanced economies follow, which is that domestic demand is really what drives economic growth. That's been very hard for the Chinese to achieve, and that really remains a major challenge, even in the context of this COVID-19 crisis.
Those are very interesting points, and I think specifically about the efficiency of the stimulus package and this desire to stimulate consumption, and it may explain some of the particularities of the Chinese response. I've seen statements by Chinese officials boasting about how their stimulus is 10 times more efficient than what we're seeing in the West. But also some of the direct stimulus to individuals, rather than providing, for example, stimulus checks, the majority of the individual stimulus has come in the form of these spending vouchers,
right,
that have to be consumed in a short amount of time before they expire.
Yeah, and that is a direct response to what I was saying before, the concern about the stagnation may be too strong a word, but the stability or the lack of rapid growth in domestic consumer demand. We would call it the inelasticity of consumer demand. If you give a family $1,000, chances are, especially given the uncertainty of the current circumstances, they're going to save a lot of it, not spend it. And that, in fact, that's what's happening, what seems to be happening in the US with a lot of the cash transfers to families, that, if a household faces the possibility of unemployment or a furlough or its own business running into difficulties, and they get a bunch of money from the government, the wise thing to do is to spend what you need, but save as much as you can. And that may make sense in the American context, but in the Chinese context, it again contributes to this problem of not being able to stimulate domestic consumer demand. So you give them vouchers that have to be spent in the next 2 months or 3 months, and they have no choice but to spend it. That's the idea behind it. I'm not sure it'll work, but I mean, the money will be spent. But I don't think it will have the longer-term impact on consumer demand that the Chinese government is hoping for.
Yeah, so maybe practical approach, but the jury's still out on whether.
Jury's still out. Again, just to reemphasize the underlying point, the Chinese economy is not a standard issue Western style or even Eastern style market economy. It has many characteristics of a market economy, but it also has many remaining characteristics of not a centrally planned economy, but a very heavily state-intervened economy. And that means that it runs differently than a lot of Western economies, in both a positive sense, I suppose, and in a negative sense. So we'll have to see how it works out in China. They've been very successful epidemiologically. I mean, the centralized sort of authoritarian control has meant that after their first problems in Wuhan, they've been able to really damp down the spread of the virus. But on economic fronts, it's, as you say, I think the final verdict, so to speak, for now is that the jury is still out.
So we'll have to wait and see. Thank you so much.
Okay, great.
Hi, Mary. My question to you is, how much has the ground shifted since the US and China arrived at this trade deal in the middle of January this year? And is that deal even viable now? President Trump keeps threatening that he's going to withdraw from the deal. He's going to scrap it. Is that at all credible? Is that threat credible, given that U.S. is so dependent on China for PPEs, ventilators, and all of that stuff?
Well, that's a really great question. Actually, two questions. So first, let's just think a little bit about what was in the deal in January. There were some promises by China to clean up on technology transfer issues and intellectual property protections. There was some market opening for U.S. agricultural items. China changed some ways that it regulated imports into the country that would make it easier for U.S. exporters to get into the market. And there were also some other minor changes. But the main part of the agreement was a promise by China to buy $200 billion worth of U.S. exports over the next 2 years. And these exports were going to be divided among four different categories. Each category had an overall target. The categories were agriculture, manufacturers, services, and an other category. Some of the big ticket items that we hoped might help China reach those metrics were the purchase of aircraft, because if China had just signed a deal to buy aircraft in the future, that would have counted. Of course, we were also looking for big purchases by China of soybeans, pork, various meats. So that would have been good, and President Trump was really hoping for this because, of course, China's retaliatory tariffs had really hurt U.S. farm country. Now, many people at the time felt that the promises that President Trump was able to extract from China in the Phase 1 deal were pretty modest. The president and his team were promising a Phase 2, which were going to handle more deeply some of these issues involving technology theft, cyber theft of U.S. trade secrets, and intellectual property, etc. However, many people viewed these purchasing targets as so big as to be impossible to meet. In fact, I wrote with Chad Bound of the Peterson Institute about how these purchases would basically either have to steal exports from other partners, which China said it wasn't going to do. It was going to do them on World Trade Organization consistent basis, which would not involve it deliberately switching away from another partner, say Brazil, which also exports soybeans, or it would have to be mandated by the Chinese state. And many people always viewed that as quite ironic, that the US is criticizing China for being state-driven, and yet we forced it to sign a deal which would require the state to mandate purchases. So what happened with COVID-19? It comes along, it makes it harder for these purchasing targets to be reached. Why? First of all, because demand in China virtually collapsed for many goods. You can think about aircraft and what's happened to air travel. So there's not much need for new airplanes when lots of airplanes are simply parked somewhere in the desert. Secondly, of course, U.S. factories closed with stay-at-home orders and lockdown orders in many states. So there really wasn't U.S. supply. In fact, global trade flows this year are forecast to plummet, falling between 20 and 30%. So there's going to be a very steep drop in trade worldwide, and that will include U.S.-China trade and U.S. exports to China. So the probability that these purchasing targets can be met in the next 2 years is looking dim. But I have to say, there's no requirement that China meet month-to-month goals. And so, you know, it's still possible. There's still a long way to go. The agreement was signed only several months ago, and they have, you know, another 22 months or so to meet this. But still, overall, these were always going to be a very tough slog. Now, the second part of your question really was whether Trump's threats are credible. And I have to say, everything this president has done with trade policy has been unprecedented, and oftentimes we've asked ourselves, is he even able to do that, to use U.S. laws and machinery to do what he's doing? Of course, we know now that there's also some movement. There's been a bill introduced in the Senate by a Republican and in the House by Democrats to pull the U.S. out of WTO. Again, something that's completely unprecedented. We wouldn't have thought about that since the World Trade Organization is the U.S. own creation. So I don't want to say never with anything, but it seems unlikely to me that President Trump would want to pull the plug on this deal. More conflict with China would lead to more tariffs, which will hurt U.S. manufacturing, and more Chinese retaliatory tariffs, which will go harder to hurt more agricultural interests who have been promised big purchases, let's not forget, as well as other U.S. exporters. So prior to the election, I really don't see an upside. The counter argument to that is that Trump is using China bashing as a way to define his campaign. And we'll see whether that's just going to be rhetoric or whether he will actually go a further step and pull out of the deal.
But his dependence, about the U.S. dependence on PPE, does that make his threats less credible than before? Or he doesn't care?
Well, pulling out of the deal wouldn't necessarily end all imports from China. We do have alternative suppliers. China is not the only supplier for just about everything. There's a couple little things. And in fact, the U.S. has had to exempt those products from tariffs. One reason why we had fewer of those goods in stock is that President Trump had put tariffs on them, and our imports of them had fallen steeply in the prior year. So we are still importing PPE from China, and we will continue to need that. But him pulling out of the deal wouldn't necessarily mean an end to those flows. He might want to wait until U.S. production is a little bit more secure, though.
Thank you, Mary. That was great. All right. So I think if no one has anything to add, we can move to the Q&A session. And Yingi can basically start off the Q&A session with a question of her own. Yeah, Yingi?
Sure. Thank you for the opportunity to. It's a great panel, great discussion. I want to make observation here, and we have been talking so much about the international stage, and I want to bring attention back to China, the internal politics. At the probably you all have noticed that over the past 2 months or so, starting from early February to early April, there has been quite a dramatic change of positions in terms of the general public support for the Chinese government, or so-called state legitimacy. So right now there is a huge amount of grassroots support for the Chinese government within China. And this stands in sharp contrast to the pretty difficult and challenging and even hostile situation China face and Chinese government face on the international stage. So, so I want to see what do you see the implications of this pretty big divide between this domestic support and the international opposition or lack of international support. And what is the implication on the U.S.-China relations? What's the implications of this overall international relations? And probably, I don't know, Alan, is that in your area of expertise?
Sure. So it's a good observation and question, but I would come back at you and ask to what level of confidence we have in the depth of support for the CCP right now within the PRC. And that just 3 months ago, people like Li Wenliang and others were being celebrated as martyrs, and the state was being attacked for its cover-up of the initial outbreak of the virus and the bungling of the initial response. And when I look at Chinese social media, I see a bifurcation there between pockets of real strong nationalist support that seems to have responded quite well to the kind of shaping of narrative that's come out of Beijing, but also a number of pockets of real criticism and critical stances, and still blaming Beijing for not doing better early on. So I think it's way too early to tell really how this is going to fall out, and if it strengthens Xi's hand at the top of the Chinese party state or not. And that speaks to the broader question of, and again, as a political scientist, of how the pandemic may reshape politics around the globe, and is it going to strengthen authoritarian regimes, as it appears to maybe be doing, or not. So actually, for what was it, about 10 years ago, I think Foreign Policy had this thing on their front page saying if you were submitting something, you couldn't start with saying after the Cold War, et cetera, et cetera. They were no longer accepting those sorts of submissions. I think for a few years we'll be able to say after the pandemic, and then there'll probably be a prohibition on that. But yeah, I think it's exceptionally hard to read Chinese politics right now more than ever. There's debates going on about really how firm of a hand Xi has over the party right now, right? And if there maybe are divisions that exist there. We're in a crisis all across the globe, and it's really, really hard to make sense of long-term trends against such a backdrop.
Yeah, can I follow up to your earlier question in terms of the extent to which the support, the public support they've got? I just want to bring you this one example of there is a female writer called Fang Fang Journal. It's a big thing on Chinese social media. So just 2 months ago, Fang Fang Journal. Basically, Fang Fang is a woman writer in Wuhan, and she's writing a journal every day during the 60-day or I don't know how many days of lockdown. And during the a big part of the journal writing, she got a lot of fan base, and a lot of people are supporting her. And right now, really supporting her is a minority, definitely a minority of people. So I noticed a dramatic change of public support just based on this support to Fang Fang Journal, this writing, especially after Fang Fang has signed a contract with the Western publishing press to publish this journal. And all of a sudden, there's a huge sense of nationalism, and people are thinking this journal is going to add fuel to this blaming China rhetoric. And Fang Fang all of a sudden becoming almost like a traitor. So that's how drastic the change of support has been. But you're right, there's definitely some kinds of a diversity going on in terms of the Chinese sort of public support about the government. But I just want to I just noticed it's quite a puzzle in terms of the international. It's not just in the United States, but also in Africa, in Europe. There is a pretty big pushback and hostile kinds of attitudes towards China now. And that is coupled with this growing support, I would say, within the domestic sphere. It's a pretty drastic divide, I would say. Yeah.
Any other responses? So we are getting some questions on the in the Q&A box, and let me start with a couple of questions. One from Onur Partal, who's a former Maxwell alum now in Istanbul, and this question is to Mary, and he's asking, how would these increased tariffs affect the U.S. current account balance? Is it going to actually reduce the deficit? And how basically would it, and during this time of crisis, would these tariffs adversely affect consumers more than in normal times? And the second question is, there are two related questions here, is about collaboration between Chinese and US universities. This is from Shui Chen, and she wants to know whether these tensions are going to actually affect the collaborations that take place between Chinese and US universities. And also, there's another question about asking what the prospects are of welcoming back Chinese students on US campuses in the fall. So those, and the remaining questions, we have a few more questions, and hopefully more questions will come into our Q&A box, but we'll start with these.
Okay, so I start with a question from Onur Patel. First, Onur is a very successful Maxwell grad operating out of Turkey. He has 2 beautiful children, so love to your kids, Onur. It's nice to hear from you. The analysis of the trade war has been astonishing. It astonished most international economists with the solidity of results showing that the tariff was passed forward to American companies and consumers. I'm doing work on it right now, and the response has been almost entirely on the quantity side, not on the price side. So we have seen some flex in supply chains away from China, but it costs money to move stuff around. Every other location is more expensive, and it has not had an effect on prices in terms of driving down the price that Americans have to pay. So that means we're left with the tax. Is this going to be inflationary? Not in this environment. Right now, we're in very unlikely. It's just not going to be that much left to tax. There's never going to be $1 trillion of new tariff revenue, as the president said this week. But so I don't think this is a big concern about the inflation. Is it going to hurt American manufacturers when they're trying to get back on their feet? The answer would absolutely be yes. Most of the tariffs are falling on inputs that producers use in the U.S. Having said that, though, you have to look at what's left to tax. And a lot of it is remaining items that have relatively low tax, like things, apparel, so-called, your Walmart goods, the things that you buy at Walmart or Target that producers see. Those were left, consumers see. Those were left to the end. And then, of course, laptops and cell phones, the Apple tax. This is something that President Trump and his administration never wanted to do. So I don't think that this is a big concern for us. It is going to be a big problem for the U.S. economy when it's trying to get back on its feet, but I don't think we're going to see it. I'm going to let Yingyi, who's a real expert on U.S. Universities in China, respond to the second part of the question. I will only add that the U.S. deterioration of the relationship has actually definitely made it harder for U.S. universities to coordinate with Chinese universities. And this is on both sides. In China, it's a bifurcation of the internet, being unable to use things like Zoom and Dropbox and other things that just make the day-to-day activities of doing joint research difficult. But it's also in the US with suspicion of Chinese scientists, what are viewed by Chinese scientists as harassment and increased costs for labs to employ foreign students in the lab. So both sides here we're seeing where it's actually government policy that is adding a lot of friction and a lot of cost and making the relationship much harder.
So Yingyi, you want to respond to the university's question a little bit?
The question on the U.S.-China higher education collaboration?
Yes, and also what do you think of the prospects of welcoming back Chinese students on U.S. campuses in the fall? Because you've actually written a lot on Asian students in America, right? So I think you would be the expert here.
I will start with from the students' question first. I think a lot of people are very worried about this pandemic will slowing down the international students' mobility, and some people in international education sector are concerning that they're never going to be a way back to their previous height of international education booming business. I am actually cautiously optimistic about that because, as Mary just said, no matter what, China still has the largest middle class population, and it's rising. It's still in terms of its size, and the rising middle class population. They share something in common, which is their children's education, and that actually drives the demand for international education and drives the student population coming to the United States and also the UK and Canada and all these other Western countries. So I see China will continue to remain the sending country of the largest international students population, even though the pace of that is slowing down, and that's just natural. Anything it could not really, the growth rate over the past decade has been astronomical. It has already been slowing down, and this pandemic will definitely send some shock effect to slow down, but it will come back. So that's my response to the student question. In terms of the university collaboration, I am very concerned for two aspects. For both countries, as you said, the American higher education has this very draconian scrutiny right now about the Chinese scientists, and definitely sending pretty chilly signals to Chinese students, to Chinese scholars and researchers, and to the future collaboration. And as you can see, some of the scholarship in China, the 1,000 Talent program has been taken down. And if you search on the internet, you could not really find much information anymore about 1,000 Talent, because FBI and NIH have been very much scrutinized the policy, and has been. I was in Seattle as a national committee, public intellectual program group with the Seattle leading law firm, and the law firm has been dealing with the spy accusations for Chinese scientists, and there has been almost every other day there's a new case. So it's definitely a very, very serious situation right now. And on the Chinese side, their higher education right now, over the past few years, definitely undergoing a more, I would say, authoritarian control, especially in terms of
humanities and social science. I think it's very important to differentiate the subjects and the disciplines when we're talking about Chinese higher education of their academic freedom. For the STEM fields, they enjoy very, very good support, and talking about academic freedom, probably not so much of difference compared to their Western counterparts in terms of fundings, in terms of all kinds of student support. The STEM faculty have a good time. But for non-STEM faculty, for people like us, sociologists and humanities and political scientists, it's a very, very difficult time. There is a mechanism of reporting of inappropriate remarks. The professors have been instructing in the classroom. So all of that will definitely influence the US-China collaboration in terms of higher education. And you see the Confucius Institute have a very hard time right now in the United States. But here's something that I want to throw in the mix. That is Chinese higher education, even in this aspect of humanities and social science, they have a very, very much heavier control than before. They still have a lot of complexity going on in terms of the policy and the administrative support of their so-called internationalization effort. There has been, for example, every major university during the summer before the pandemic, they have this international summer school. They invited faculty from American higher education to give talk, give lectures there. And a lot of social science faculties and get invitation to do that. So they have this push for the world-class university in China. And because in order to achieve that, they have to have a lot of this kind of academic exchange. They send students abroad on the state-funded trips, and they encourage those kinds of academic exchanges. But at the same time, they also have those kinds of control and monitoring and tracking going on.
So would the other panelists like to say something about these issues?
If you don't mind, I'll chime in for a sec.
Yeah.
First, and given that we have so many participants, to add everyone's reading a little bit more, hopefully, the book which came out just recently, The Scientist and the Spy, I'm forgetting the author's name, and I just taught it 2 weeks ago, is both a remarkable discussion of this question of kind of industrial espionage within the relationship, but also sheds a light on the complexity of the economic and political relationship. It's a fabulous book and a really good read. It makes Corn actually interesting. I'm not quite sure how that happens, but it did. I think Yingyi's comments are well made, but I, as the director of a program that has operations in China, am particularly in the short term not very sanguine as to where things are headed. Frankly, I think I'm highly skeptical that in the fall Chinese universities would be allowing international students to attend classes in person, and I'm not quite sure how we're going to get there even if we have in-person instruction either. Over the medium term, I also think that the level of distrust between the two sides is pretty high. And I think American universities, quite frankly, have treated Chinese students somewhat as a commodity over the past couple of decades in terms of tuition dollars, or past decade in terms of tuition dollars. And it's been a relatively cheap one. And I think it's going to take a lot more effort to kind of build back up trust in what we're providing. And it also is dependent upon ease of movement across international boundaries. And if what Jeff is saying is true, and that becomes more difficult, I also don't know that bodes very well. Over the long term, I'm still optimistic, but I think it's going to be a lot of rocky sailing between now and there, and we're all going to have to change the way that I've already changed the way I do research in the country. I think our students need to change their expectations about what they can learn, and our two countries are also going to need to adapt as well.
All right, so I turn this, so Dimitar has probably collected a few questions and he'll present those questions.
So I have a couple of questions that have come in concerning technology. And so I'll spotlight one of them at the top. So Roland asks about 5G and China's investment in 5G technology. And I think the background here is that this pandemic has really jumpstarted or pushed forward our transition into digitizing all of our economies. And this is kind of open to all the panelists. Do you think China has an advantage because the state has moved, taken kind of a first mover step in pushing technology like 5G technology? And I think what Roland's question is suggesting here is, might we see more state intervention on the US part in trying to kind of keep up in this now very rapidly heating up technology competition?
Go first, Mary.
I mean, yeah, I think this is a great area. It's one that we all need to keep our eye on. I think China does have a first mover advantage in digitization. The US has been slow to invest. We have areas of the country that aren't even, able to have students go online because they don't have access to the internet. We're not able to get money out to our citizens quickly because we're not, in some sense, the government can't reach people. Yet we saw China roll out the red, yellow, and green codes within a month by cooperating with its big tech companies. There's some scary stuff there, which is that if the government can follow your every move, what does that mean? But still, they have the capacity. Having said that, we have to realize that China is still very much dependent on the West in some areas of technology. Just looking at the thing that we all want right now, which is N95 masks. This material that forms it, it's a non-woven material that acts as a filter. Making that is dependent on machines that are made in Germany. So most of the world, we think about who makes what. What you should really be thinking about is who's making the machines that make the same thing in semiconductors and other key things. So China, I predicted early on, and it was an easy prediction to make, that even in the trade war, China was not going to try to turn off the flow of foreign investment to its economy because it still needs access to Western technology. So I think the West has a lot to learn here. Will we see state investment? Yes. I think in the United States, we're already seeing it through the defense budget. It's a shame that we aren't having a larger, sort of civil society discussion about what types of investment we want, including in people and in education. But I think it's definitely coming. It's coming in all nations. So I would say, yes, this is just accelerating a conversation that we have either been having or needing to have for a long time.
And I would say, just to continue on from what Mary said, which I agree with completely, is the U.S. has shamefully reduced government support for research and development over the last really 25 years, and it's continued to reduce that investment. The federal government involvement in research and development in the early post-war period was absolutely essential. Some of it was through the defense budget, but a lot of it was non-defense related, and it's pretty much dried up. The Europeans are way ahead of us in state investment in research and development, and I think we're going to realize the consequences. So I certainly hope that there will be more federal and state government involvement in research and development, and that it won't have to all be defense related or justified on a defense related platform. Because if we don't, we're going to find ourselves far behind on some very crucial technologies, whether in telecommunications or in other areas. Our regulatory structure for telecommunications is another problem, which contributes to our being behind both East Asia and Europe. But I think the Huawei incident or the Huawei process or phenomenon, I think, highlights some of the mistakes that have been made and some of the problems that American government policy has gotten us into. Insufficient investment by the government in research and development, and insufficient encouragement for the private sector to be at the forefront of technological development in some areas, not all areas, but in some areas. So I think it's a real challenge, which we're losing at this point.
So there are a couple of questions here. They're mainly for Jeff, I think. One is about how does this affect financial relations within Europe, and whether this kind of paves the road for another Brexit. This is from Vincenzo at La Sapienza in Rome.
Oh, Sapienza, right.
And he's directing this question to Jeff Frieden. And then one of our own students, Wang Pham, who just graduated, is going to the Oregon State as an assistant professor. He's asking whether this, the way China managed this pandemic, has it been a good advertisement for China's political model? It's been, he says it's been better at managing the pandemic than the Western countries. So I guess these questions go to Jeff.
Okay, well, on the first, yeah, the European situation is pretty serious. As we all know, the Southern European countries in particular have been incredibly hard hit. Actually, I should say the hardest hit country on a per capita basis, leaving aside Andorra, which I think is Belgium. Belgium has the highest per capita incidence, both of cases and of deaths. But Southern Europe more generally has been extremely hard hit. And as Vincenzo knows, and anyone who's following the news knows, there has been an attempt, as there was during the great financial crisis and the Eurozone sovereign debt crisis, to try to build a Europe-wide response that would share responsibility, both political and financial, for dealing with the crisis. I guess the evidence is mixed. On the positive front, the Europeans have moved forward with attempts to have a Europe-wide approach to the problem, with a Europe-wide financial assistance going to both from the fiscal side, that is from the Commission, and from the European Central Bank. The European Central Bank has been extremely active in, I think, pretty much all the right ways in supporting, especially the more troubled governments and societies in Southern Europe. On the fiscal side, there's been more movement towards contributions from the richer countries, or the countries in less difficulty, especially in Northern Europe, to those in Southern Europe. So on the positive front, there has been motion, and I think those of us who are extremely frustrated by the very inadequate and completely failed response to the sovereign debt crisis in Europe after 2010, there's a little bit of I feel a lot happier about the European response to this than I do about the response to the financial crisis and the sovereign debt crisis. On the other hand, there is still reticence on the part of those in Northern Europe to recognize that, we're all in this together and they're all in this together, that Europe is going to rise or fall as a unit, both epidemiologically and economically, and that it is in the best interest of the Northern Europeans to try to ensure that countries like Spain and Belgium and Italy are able to weather this crisis and come out of it without lasting damage to their economies and their societies. So I think I'm guardedly optimistic that things are moving in the right direction, but there's still a long way to go. Whether there'll be another Brexit, by which I assume you mean another country leaving. The British can't leave twice. But I don't see it. I don't see it. If anything, Brexit seems to have strengthened the desire on the part of most Europeans to build the European Union and strengthen. And this pandemic, I think, has also done that, in the sense that it is there has been a Europe-wide response, and people recognize microbes don't respect borders, and that the European Union is in this together. The one area where I think I'm a little worried is actually not in the traditional members, but in countries like Hungary and Poland, where you have highly nationalistic populist leaders who really have set their face against a lot of the basic principles underlying European integration. And there was continuing friction between the other members of the European Union on the one hand and Poland and Hungary on the other. So that's where I see things on the European front. And then the second question was about the attractiveness of the China model, given its success, relative success in confronting the pandemic, I don't think that's what most people are focusing on. I think first of all, that there has been very clear guidance from the international sector, the WHO and elsewhere, as to what to do. And countries throughout sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, and Latin America have implemented epidemiologically sound principles in trying to address the epidemiological aspects of the crisis. But I do think that the events of the last decade, or 15 years or so, have made the China model economically much more attractive to a lot of people in the developing world. And this is associated with China's Belt and Road Initiative and its attempt to encourage more interaction with countries in the rest of Asia and in Africa. Some of that is now facing difficulties because countries that had borrowed very heavily as part of the Belt and Road Initiative are running into debt problems, and the Chinese are discovering that being a creditor isn't all it was cracked up to be, that they're facing real serious financial difficulties that are undoubtedly going to mean that they're going to have to write down a lot of the debt that they've extended to developing countries. But I do think that China, from an economic standpoint, looks pretty attractive as an economic model to a lot of people in the developing world, especially in Asia and Africa. And that's where I see the Chinese model gaining adherence. I wonder what Mary has to think about that last, especially.
So let me, if I can, Jeff, I want to kind of spin this thread a little bit further because there are a number of questions in the Q&A about, the China model, China influence. And throughout our discussion, we have also kind of referenced what's going on with domestic politics around the world. Alan used the term authoritarianization. And so I want to pick up on one thing you mentioned, Jeff, is that microbes don't respect borders. And it really does seem like the entire world is facing a stress test. States around the world are facing a stress test. And looking forward in all of our respective homes, communities, and countries, the way we manage ourselves, the way we manage social distancing, testing, all these things moving forward are really going to determine to what extent we can open up our economies, to what extent we can ride this out and get back to, if not a normal, something more normal, right? And it seems to me that moving forward, the successful case, we don't know if that's going to be China or not, will have more influence in terms of a model or in terms of just material influence moving forward. And in that regard, do perhaps some of the controls that China have, the Chinese government has, does that give them an edge? Does the backlash we're seeing in the United States right now, the kind of the polarization we're seeing in some of the backlash towards restrictions, is that something to be worried about moving forward? And so that's really kind of a question to anyone in the panel. And after that, I think it might be nice to give our panelists an opportunity to question each other. So if anybody wants to jump in with a question for one of your co-panelists, I think that would be a good time to do that, or in a moment.
Dimitar, I'll just pick up first briefly on your question. I think right now, more than anything else, all of us, whether we're academics or work in the private sector or anything else, are just trying to make sense of what's unfolding. And in that context, I then think our guiding principles should be having a great deal of skepticism, both towards those who blame and those who boast. And we're seeing a ton of that on both sides of the Pacific. And so frankly, I think you can just shunt most of that aside. And then maybe focusing more on the policy issues, the public health issues that are less politicized and less about assigning blame or garnering a gold star. It should be a guide. It should be the way that we approach all this. At least that's what I'm trying to do. And I don't really know, but at least I know enough to think that sounds too good to be true, or that sounds a little far-fetched, like your Mel Gibson and conspiracy theory. And that's not helpful. I'm not sure that that's an answer, but goodness, when it comes to the efficacy of policies, just describing it, just in terms of descriptive analysis right now is exceedingly difficult. Then if we want to think about causal analysis, the variables just, and I'm not a very good political scientist, but I can even tell that there's a lot there to unpack. Jeff, you might, I think you're better, and Mary too, but so maybe, what do you think?
So I guess I have a two-pronged response, which is, one thing that has amazed me is how collaborative the social response has been. That people have abided by these strictures even when governments were way behind them. And there's a new paper out, an NBER paper, showing that the majority of the compliance is independent of the policy. Right? That is, that people find out that social distancing, or physical distancing is the preferred term, I think, that physical distancing and isolation and quarantining are crucial, not necessarily for your own health, but for the health of others, and they obey, and they do it. And it's, to me, it's a remarkable indication of the sort of sense of social solidarity that pretty much all of our societies are feeling. It's remarkable. On the other hand, the failures at the government level have been, I think, really quite serious. And there is both the short-term failure that we've noticed in countries that did not move, and states in the US that did not move fast enough and are coming out too fast. And then the long-term, which is we have for decades underinvested in public health. I mean, we have been warned for years that a global pandemic was inevitable, and nothing was done. I mean, you can go back 20 years and find year after year people talking about the need for preparedness, the need for preparation, the need for preventive medicine, preventive policies at the global level, and nothing. So I think there have been failures at the government level, and there will continue to be failures unless and until people start holding their governments to account for the public health response, and especially a preventive approach to public health. One other thing that I would say is, this isn't over. It's probably going to get worse before it gets better. And we're going to be living in a COVID world for the next couple of years at least, unless a vaccine is miraculously discovered in the next few months. And so our societies and our governments are going to be put to a really severe test. Up to now, most of them have weathered the test they've been put to, but there is going to be additional stress, not only in the US, but around the world. So I think I'm not putting down any bets until I see what happens over the next couple of years and how people and government respond to the next series of waves in dealing with this pandemic.
So there's a question from Max Palmer from Ipstock Place School in London, and he's asking, would the costs of tariffs felt by U.S. consumers hurt Trump in the presidential elections in November?
Well, there has been some work showing that Trump was hurt in the midterm elections, but it was mainly from retaliation that hit Republican areas. So I think that he has been hurt. If he does go ahead with more tariffs, you can be certain that there will be retaliation and that it will have an effect. So I have said all along, I don't think that he has much to gain politically from more tariffs. He will continue to blame China for COVID-19. That seems a more fertile ground for him. So yeah, I think it will hurt him. It will hurt him. Getting back to what Jeff said, I think there has been enormous cooperation below the level of government. It is true that the governmental failure has been rather astonishing and sad. But there's been enormous donations, planes being flown between China and the US and other locations to provide PPE. We can't just look at the negatives. Most of us who have had Chinese students have had requests from our Chinese students to send masks to us. Many of us have just received masks. I have had the most empathetic emails from my students in Wuhan who have experienced what a lockdown is like. So I think on a people basis, this does go deeper. very early on, I was at a meeting with venture capitalists in New York, and it was at the start of the pandemic, and they were already talking about the teams that were working transnationally to try to find the antibody tests to get the vaccine up and running. And we've seen report after report since then about the international scientific cooperation. So there has been an enormous, over the last 30 years, globalization of what we might think of as sort of the people-to-people movement, and that still exists. I think this is one reason why it was such a backlash in Europe to the receipt of PPE that was of very poor quality, and why China responded very dramatically. They really closed down the ports to increase inspection. I think that was misinterpreted in the West as a hostile act. I think it was actually a positive act to try to get good supplies out to the West as a sign that we are in this together. So I do think there are some positives here. I do share your gloom in a lot of ways about the government response. I think if we do get a change in administration, there will be a turn back toward multilateralism. And the Europeans, I think, while they were upset and don't see the China model as something they want to follow, as I think neither do many developing countries, but still, they want a world with cooperation. They see that as the only way that they can develop. And I think that could, we shouldn't count it out for dead yet.
Jeff, any response?
I agree. I mean, I was going to say that this is, I don't know about revolutionized, but certainly changed all dimensions of cooperation. In the scientific world, all sorts of scientific journals have now taken away paywalls, and things are being published and shared back and forth that wouldn't have been thought of a year ago or 2 years ago, because we are all in this together, as they say. And so there's that. There is the cooperation among governments, which has happened on many dimensions. The strongest, global public health is perhaps the strongest single argument for global cooperation, for the very reason that, you cannot protect yourself against epidemics. If the country next to you has an infectious disease, you're going to get it. So there are strong reasons for cooperation. It still is disturbing that, there have been these failures of cooperation and failures of preparedness. I mean, it's easy to say, well, that's something in the future, and politicians are only concerned about the next election, but not all policymakers are only concerned about the next election, and many policymakers think farther and think about the future. And I think we need to hold our policymakers to account for failures like not preparing for what everybody agreed was inevitable. So I also agree that, if we got a different administration, a lot of the things that we've been talking about going in a sort of negative direction will at least be slowed and perhaps reversed, certainly. And by the way, I can say one of the unforeseen advantages of this pandemic, this disastrous pandemic, is we can have seminars in Syracuse with people from London and Rome.
Yeah. Alan, you want to add anything to this?
I tend to agree that a Biden administration, at least in the kind of the optics, would be very different. I'm not entirely sure, though, on the substantive side, and probably in regards to economics, but on the security part of the relationship, the growing unease about China's force projection capabilities, the types of theaters of conflict that could occur in China's near seas and beyond, seem to cross party divides. And so I think, to a degree, you might even see a more hawkish stance from the Biden administration, because it would also be part of a more of a comprehensive policy. I want to go back. I really do feel that this administration has been quite schizophrenic in the way that it's approached the relationship. And that, again, goes to his advisors and the divide between them, but also his personality. And there is something that he sees in Xi Jinping that maybe his mom sees as well, but I don't know that anyone else does. which is during last summer, at the height of as the Hong Kong protests were cresting or beginning to crest, the president tweeted about how he was confident that she had the situation under control, which was a remarkable statement for a U.S. president to be making. So I don't know. I think that, again, there's so much volatility and so much turbulence that we're facing. Tomorrow may be entirely different than today.
Dimitar, any more questions you have, or you've collected any more? Or are there any more? Or... You're muted, Dimitar.
I think we've addressed most of the questions that are in the Q&A. I was wondering if the panelists did have any questions for one another. If not, I think we can probably wrap up with one final question from either from Devashish or from me or from Mingyi.
I have a question for Jeff and Alan, which is that what is the future of Belt and Road after this? As Jeff mentioned, China is the debt holder on a lot of debt, and there's been some concern about China's role in providing debt relief to developing countries. It hasn't been tested as much as it might. The pandemic is far from over. We're seeing a big increase in Latin America and other places right now. So is this spelling the end of the Belt and Road, or a much smaller, slower Belt and Road going forward?
Go ahead, Alan.
I'm not sure that I am, Jeff. I have to say that over the past 5 years, each summer having to attend One Belt, One Road to Belt Road conferences and discussions, my eyes just kind of glaze over. And I know that's actually not the appropriate response because it's a major initiative and all the rest of it. I do think that there's real questions, Marianne, you know this better than I do, about the maybe discrepancy between promised and actualized support, whether it's direct financial aid or investment or anything else. And I'd go back to Yingyi's early sort of observation. I wonder if we're seeing a pronounced downturn, the extent to which at a grassroots level, the Chinese population will be enthusiastic about what would be perceived as an outflow of aid and support when there's real hardship within the country itself. And I know already there's a little bit of grumbling about that. So in terms of the politics, I think that's a side to really give some consideration to.
Yeah, I would say that, borrowing is great before you have to pay back, and lending is great before you have to get paid back. And I think both sides of this really, so the Belt and Road Initiative is many things, but the core of it really is an extension, either directly or through the AIIB, of financial resources to build up infrastructure. And, at this point, there's a lot of money out there that the Chinese have lent directly or indirectly to developing countries. And they're finding, like lenders have for hundreds of years before them, that, when you lend money out to poor countries, they sometimes default. And these countries are either going to restructure or default. So I think there's going to be, it will be troubled. And if we just think through what the implications are, there'll be resentment of the Chinese because they're the creditors. The creditors are the bad guys enforcing austerity on the debtor countries. And there'll be hostility on the part of the Chinese saying, we gave you these loans at concessional terms and now you're not paying us back. So I see a toughening of relations between China and the countries that have been more recently drawn into the Chinese orbit. And that's going to be difficult for them to manage because it's not a problem that China has had up until now of being a major creditor for developing countries. It's been able to present itself as one of the developing countries. We understand your problems. Well, now they're causing problems for the Sri Lankas and the Tanzanias of the world. And that'll be a big switch. And that's going to be difficult to manage. I do think that the broader trend, that is, of Chinese attempts to encourage more economic interaction with other countries in Asia and Africa will continue. It is a natural result of China's geopolitical and economic position in the world. It is mutually beneficial. It's a country with both labor and capital and resource and and very few natural resources and a need for natural resources. And there are a lot of countries in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa that have great complementarities with the Chinese economy, and that's going to be exploited. So on the political front, there will be conflict. It could get bitter at times, but I think that the economic ties between China, and for that matter, India, and the rest of the developing world, especially in Eurasia and Africa, will continue to grow. My question for Mary, so retribution, is we had a little bit of a back and forth about the Chinese economy in the chat here, and I think we agree, perhaps, that one of the great weaknesses of the Chinese economy is the private consumer sector, not the private corporate sector, but the consumer sector. And that not only has the public sector grown, public investment grown, but the private consumption share of GDP just continues to drop. And that's not a stable, or that's not a sustainable path for the Chinese economy. So I guess my question is, do you foresee growth in the private sector of the Chinese economy that can pull the economy forward? Because if there isn't, I'm more pessimistic than I would have been otherwise about the Chinese economic future.
Well, consumption includes production by the state sector as well as by the private sector. If we focus in on the private sector, I think you put your thumb on the Achilles heel for China moving forward. Made in China 2025, is dealing with the elite part of the Chinese economy. There are many warning signs about what's happening to China. Let me just name two that I think are very important. One is that investment has become terribly skewed towards state enterprises, and that's going to continue as credit expansion is necessary to pull the economy forward in the recovery phase. So it's like 80% of investment funds going to the state, 20 to private. And before the great financial crisis, it was the opposite. It was 20-80. So you have most of the investment funds going to state companies that frankly deliver a very low return on investment. So that's a problem. Secondly, we have from a very dynamic and very fast growing in terms of productivity private sector that we saw after China's accession to the WTO, we have a private sector now where productivity growth is by some researchers counts 0. This is a major concern for China. Rising wages, rising environmental costs, growing demand from a middle class, and yet 0 productivity growth. I think they've been keeping it hidden by a lot of debt and a lot of construction, but ultimately these firms are going to have productivity. They're banking on sort of the new economy, but all of us know that a lot of it still goes down to services, education, healthcare, restaurants, and these are very hard sectors in which to raise productivity, as we know in the West. So I think that China has a very difficult road ahead of it. It's not really about what we do to them. I think all along our ability to so-called hurt China was misguided, but also basically toothless. Where they're really hurting is themselves right now. And a lot of the reforms that are contained in phase 1, they actually want to do. They know they've got a problem. But I think that's the real Achilles heel is productivity growth. They have to continue to deliver economic growth for the state to maintain legitimacy. And that, I think, long-term is at risk.
All right, so this brings us to the end of this online roundtable. This is great fun, and we would like to end on an optimistic note. And I'll quote Jeff, who said, global public health is the strongest and the biggest reason for global cooperation. And so on behalf of the organizers, Dimitar and myself, I must thank the panelists, Mary, Jeff, and Alan, as well as our MC today, Yingyi, for agreeing to get together and do this, get together virtually and do this at such short notice. And we are really indebted to Juanita Horan and her team, Hava Karakash and Morgan Bicknell, for working out and planning the logistics, designing the invites and the ad, figuring out all the webinar details in Zoom, etc. And without their help, we couldn't have done this. I should also thank Sally here. And we also thank Matt Coulter and Tom Fazio from ICT for patiently helping us figure everything out. And finally, in this world, nothing happens without money. So we thank our sponsors and profusely for financial support. The sponsors of this event were the Moynihan Institute, the Asian and Asian American Studies Program, the East Asia Program, the Economics Department, the Political Science Department, the Public Administration and International Affairs Department, the International Relations Program, the Executive Education Program, all in the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. So, and thanks to everyone in the audience for having contributed towards making this a big success. Goodbye.